Welcome to the Headley Highlight Show's Headley Headspaces. The Headspaces are a series of thoughts and musings I have during the course of the week, and I chew all over them and I share them with you. And before I start, I'd like to thank all the new subscribers to my YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the bell and subscribe and sign up for notifications. You can also make a donation at denisehedley.com. And don't forget, my show airs every Friday live on X at 8 p.m. GMT, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Back to the Headspace. So this Headspace is called Zelensky's Rare Earth Mineral Scam. How many people did you actually sell that asset to, green t-shirts? So let's cast our minds back to January of this year, when we had an announcement that Britain signed a 100-year deal with Ukraine to provide them with security support. That translated to £3 billion every year for 100 years. And if you've been listening to my show, you would hear me complaining bitterly about that. Why? Because, firstly, this is a proxy war, and Europe and the rest of that gang are supporting it and inflicted a whole range of self-harm actions upon themselves, namely sanctions on Russia, which actually hurt Europe. But that aside, it was a very strange thing to do. It now turns out, based on the information I have, that 100-year deal was a trade, effectively. It was a trade to allow British companies and British interests to exploit the resources of the Ukraine. The rare earth minerals, the gas storage rights, access to land and pipelines. Britain, under Keir Starmer, the slippery, I don't even want to use the word worm, because worms, I like worms and I like slugs, but he is a slippery, oily, disingenuous, sending your sons to war individual. He went and he signed a deal with Zelensky for all of those rights, all of those accesses, and he did it to effectively get a march on Trump, because he signed it in January. Yeah, don't forget, Trump came in November, and he wasn't fully inaugurated, I think, until the 20th of January. And he signed that deal before then, unbeknown to the British public, of course. Prior to signing the deal, Zelensky had offered those rights to Trump until slippery Starmer entered into the negotiations. And I'm sure with support from Lord Mandelson, Jeffrey Epstein's close buddy, and Tony Blair, the architect of weapons of mass destruction, which killed 1 million Iraqis, they drafted a 100-page agreement with appendices, of course. And the detail was in the appendices, I can assure you. Trots over to Kiev and they both signed the agreement. Don't forget, this was all before the Munich Security Council address by J.D. Vance, where he basically rewrote, him and Trump, they rewrote the transatlantic relationship. It's, you're standing on your own now, Europe. We're not backing you. He thought he had it in the bag. And this is part of the reasons why he was pushing for Ukraine to continue in the war and for Britain to back them, because they are effectively using access to those mineral rights to underwrite long-term security for sustained income streams into the country, and possibly mainly into private companies, because you know that's not going into public use. It's not going to be used to reinvest so that we get the winter fuel allowance reapportioned or it buys more hospital beds. No. Keir Starmer is nowhere in that field of interest. He represents the deep state and he represents vested interests. And that's what he was doing. But there were a couple of snags with that plan. Number one, no deal at that juncture was negotiated with Russia, who has basically or in the process of winning this war, and they are dictating terms. They weren't privy to any agreement. So there's a stumbling block there. Zelensky didn't even have the authority to sign the contract because he's an illegitimate leader. And according to their constitution, you have to have elections every 5 years. Hence, you heard Trump calling him a dictator and the rest of the UK's establishment ran around all day saying, oh, he's not a dictator just because he doesn't have elections. It had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with the contract he signed, because effectively he cannot sign that contract. It can't be upheld because their constitution doesn't allow it. And when the war ends, there will be elections. And that elections that take place in the Ukraine is going to put in a government which is favorable to Russia. So therefore, you can't enforce that contract. So that leaves Zelensky and the UK in a quandary once again. In addition to that, in order to enforce that contract, you need peacekeepers on the ground, or should I say troops on the ground. And as a condition of the ceasefire, Putin is not going to agree to any troops. Besides, anything of that nature has to go via the UN, and both sides need to agree. Therefore, the contract is in jeopardy again because you can't rely on the Ukrainian forces to enforce that contract and to ensure where those resources actually go. Another stumbling block. The Constitution of Ukraine requires. So one of the reasons that Mr. Starmer is over in the United States meeting with Mr. Trump is because he knows that this deal is in jeopardy. Because now what the green t-shirt did was promise the mineral rights to Mr. Trump. And he's using it as a bargaining chip. All of a sudden, Mr. Trump is no longer calling him a dictator because America realizes, and Mr. Trump realizes, that those rare earth minerals and the exploitation of Ukraine as a resource, effectively, it's going to be squeezed dry like a sponge, are on the table to be negotiated for. And that's what Zelensky did. He sold the mineral rights and all of the rare earth rights and all of the assets of his country. He sold them twice. Once to Starmer and now to Trump. But the difficulty is who can actually enforce that contract. It certainly isn't the UK. And it looks like, irrespective of Starmer's slippery tactics, Mr. Trump is still in the driving seat deciding what happens with those rare earth minerals. And that's the reason why the green t-shirt is being called to sign the deal with Mr. Trump. And they're no longer calling him a dictator. In my opinion, after the peace does ensue, and we all pray that it does, I don't think the UK is going to get what it wants with this deal. And once again, Starmer has shown himself to be a slippery, oily, invertebrate, lacking humanity and foresight, and an absolutely poor leader. What is he going to come home with? An invitation to dinner? On a second state visit? Whoopee-doo. I think there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. Zelensky is a vassal leader that will sell his country to the highest bidder. Starmer is slippery and lacks humanity and will do anything to ensure his position, including sending your sons and daughters to the front line. He's a dangerous leader. And Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin are effective business people. They realize that they are the powerful ones in the room. And no matter how you get it spun for your consumption over the weekend, this was not a successful trip for Mr. Starmer or Mr. Zelensky. The only winners in this exercise have been Mr. Trump and his administration and Mr. Putin. And that's my 2 pence on the rare earth mineral scam. Effectively, the green t-shirt tried to sell it twice. But when he got into the room with the real power brokers, not the squeaky mice on the corner of the room, there were no more slanging matches. There's been no more accusations of Mr. Trump as being captured by misinformation. He's going to sign on the dotted line, and that's that. And that's my 2 pence. Any thoughts? Your 2 Ps? Your 3 cities? Or your declining dollar price? Jump up and don't be shy. Thanks for listening as well. And don't forget, make a donation and join my YouTube at DeniseHeadley.com. See you next week. Nighty night.